It's that time of the year again, and daffodils are springing up all over the place. And just about every artist I know is painting these things at the moment. So I thought I'd add my own contribution and show you the step-by-step process I used to paint these watercolor daffodils. In this tutorial I used a variety of techniques which I'll describe as I build up the painting layer by layer. And if you'd like to try this painting for yourself, then you can download my worksheet, the reference photo and the sketch template by following the link below this video. Now, daffodils are not the easiest flowers to paint. They have a complex structure and a uniform colour which makes it tricky to create depth and realism. Here's the reference photo I chose for this painting. I like the grouping and the positions of the flowers, but the subject looks quite flat. I think this is probably because the monochrome yellow flowers make it difficult to read the forms, and the white background means it's difficult to read the distance from front to back. Adding a dark background improves the composition dramatically. The contrast between the dark green background and the bright yellow daffodils helps them stand out and makes the flowers the focal point of the composition. Also, having a blurred background like this and a sharp foreground helps increase the sense of depth. As you can see in the final painting, I deliberately broadened the range of colours and the tonal values of the flowers. This helps distinguish the different parts by adding bright orange to the centres and emphasising the shading on the petals. After transferring the sketch to watercolour paper, tape down the sheet around all the edges. This is especially useful when painting big background watches like in this example to help keep the paper flat when wet. I begin by painting the flower shapes with a light mixture of lemon yellow. Notice, however, that I'm being careful to leave a few areas untouched so that I get some white highlights. Even though these don't appear to exist in the reference photo, I'm adding white because I want to create a larger range of values so that the daffodils appear to pop in the finished painting. Remember, the term values simply refers to lightness and darkness of a colour. Next I start charging in some warm yellow paint into the places where I can see that the values are stronger on the reference photo. For example, the shaded parts of the petals and the interiors of the trumpet forms at the centre of the daffodils. I'm doing this while the first wash is moderately damp. As a result, the edges become slightly blurred as the paint diffuses into the damp surface. Once this layer of paint is applied, I leave the paint to dry completely. Then I apply a warm orange colour to the centre of the flowers. As you can see, I'm using a wet on dry technique to paint these shapes. This gives me a nice crisp edge to my brush marks. Before these orange shapes have time to dry, I blend the bottom edge so that the colour fades out. This blending technique produces a nice graduated colour. Next I dabbed in some strong orange colour to the damp centres of the flowers. Then I continue to use this colour to apply more brushstrokes and build up the values in different places. Painting layers onto a dry wash like this is a watercolour technique known as glazing. You can see the flowers start to develop a more three-dimensional look as I continue to glaze. Working this way allows me to paint shapes that have both sharp edges if I leave the edge dry and soft edges if I need to blend. Keep adding this orange colour to the darker shaded parts of the flower, then leave the surface to dry all over. Before moving on to paint the stems, I added a final glaze of bright orange, leaving a sharp edge on one side and blending out the other. Next I painted the stems and the leaves. For each shape I took advantage while the paint was still moist to paint in different colours so that the pigments would fuse together and create a more interesting varied appearance. This is a version of what's known as a variegated wash. After painting the basic shapes on the leaves, I turned my attention back to the shading on the flowers. I want to give the forms of the daffodils more depth by adding some cast shadows and shading on the petals. Notice that to do this I'm not using a grey colour. Shadows are rarely pure black or grey. In this case I'm using a diluted mix of dark, neutral, blue-green. This will give the shadows a green hue which results in a more harmonious final appearance. Yellow and green together create an analogous colour harmony. Then I started painting the green background. To do this I'm using a mop brush which is ideal for laying down big washes of colour. I'm also trying to work quickly because I want the underlying wash of paint to remain damp so I can do some more wet in wet work. And to avoid the paint from drying before I finished, I stopped painting the background wash halfway up the page. Like this, I have time to add some additional brush strokes of various colours. The paints blend together smoothly, so I end up with a blurred looking backdrop. I'm also using vertical brush strokes to try and give the impression of leaves and stems. Because the paint is still damp, I can do some lifting to create a few lighter toned shapes in the background. Lifting is a watercolor technique where you blot up some of the color pigments from the surface. The objective is to create some variety and colour and value, and to try to give the background a more convincing, blurred appearance. Now I can move on to the top half of the background. Painting around objects like this is a great way to practice your brushwork. You can see that I have to twist my hand to get the tip of the brush in the right direction. However, keep in mind one of the advantages of fixing your painting onto a board is that you can turn the board around to make access easier and avoid difficult brush positions. When painting big areas like this, make sure to use plenty of paint. You want your brush to be fully loaded and very wet. Otherwise your previous washes might dry between brush loads and you'll end up with streaks and hard-edged marks instead of a more uniform appearance. If you've worked quickly enough, then the whole of your background shape should still be moist. You can now charge in some brush loads of various colours and build up a variegated wash. I'm aiming for a dark colour on the right hand side and a lighter toned colour on the left, so you can see me applying darker and darker paint on this side. Because I've already painted the first layer of colour for the background, I feel more confident about continuing to paint the second layer in one go. So you can see me continuing the wash down into the lower half of the painting. The left hand side gets treated with a lighter coloured paint. After laying down each shape, I come back into the damp wash with a few quick vertical brush strokes. The intention is to give an impression of stalks or leaves. And I do the same thing on the right hand side with a darker mixture of paint. Leave the background to dry completely before adding a new layer. You can see the colours fade slightly as they dry. This is why glazing is such a useful technique for building up the colour intensities a bit at a time. I'm now concentrating on the stems of the daffodils, adding darker lines to the gaps between the stems and some cast shadows. Continue applying this new layer of paint up into the top half of the painting. You need to work quickly, but at the same time be careful not to paint over the yellow daffodils. When you reach the right hand side, make your paint mixture progressively darker. For example, to do this I added more French ultramarine to my mix, which neutralises the colour appearance and makes a nice leafy green. This new dark mixture continues down into the bottom right of the background. At one point you can even see that I painted directly into the green wash with blue French ultramarine. Then I push the colour around with my brush so that it blends into the underlying layer of damp paint. I'm slowly working my way around the daffodils in a clockwise direction. Here I'm darkening the colour of the background between the flower stems and on the lower left. Next I wanted to add some cast shadows to the stems underneath the flower heads. This is important because it will improve the overall impression of depth of the finished painting. I continue adding cast shadows and shading on the flower petals themselves. Again, I'm adding a diluted mixture of neutral green to add the shading. When I say neutral, I mean a colour which has been dulled down to reduce its colour saturation. I added shadows as if the light was coming from the upper right hand side to the undersides of the flowers, but not too much on the higher petals. At this stage I felt the colour at the centre of the flowers needed intensifying. I think this is an important focal point in the composition, so I added a fairly strong mix of orange, being careful to paint around the white thread-like stigma in the middle. The contrast between these white parts and the strong orange colour will help attract the eye. After painting the first orange brushstrokes, I blended out the edges using a damp brush. And as a final touch, I added a few extra brush marks to boost the cast shadows on the leaves and the stems. Don't forget you can download the worksheet for this project by following the link below this video. And here's the finished painting. If you give this project a try for yourself, then let me know what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button to be alerted whenever I publish something new. Also, if you'd like to receive some free watercolor lessons that I only share with my newsletter subscribers, follow the link underneath this video to sign up.